something went wrong. Something went really wrong in a way that we don't want to replicate again. So I think we start with that baseline. And in terms of, this just being something where SPD needs to have some cultural awareness training, that also really minimizes what happened and what went wrong.
Well, the Seattle City Council attempting to shed some light this week on what went wrong with a May Day rally last year that featured a clash between a Christian group and LGBTQ plus counter-protesters. Did those 23 arrests, 16 uses of force, did those need to happen? And what's next for the Seattle Police Department when it comes to accountability? Plus, a look inside Seattle's World Cup spending. What's the return on that investment going to be? And also, what's happening with a light rail expansion project that is very simply coming up short? We are discussing these issues and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I know it's a little frustrating to see the Mariners play sub-500 baseball, but when you look past the record and see that the Mariners are just a few games out of first in their division and the Astros are dead last, does that make it feel any better? Your thoughts?
I think no, not right now. It probably will at the end of the year when they're actually a little closer to playoffs. But when you're not scoreboard watching or standing watching, then it just feels like they're playing fairly mediocre, and that's not quite so fun to watch.
Yeah, we got to pick up the game for sure. Well, Thank you, David. As always, thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patrons. M joined in as a free patron last week. Very thankful for that. I see out there free members. But it would be great to have you on board at the $5 level so you can access Patrons First podcast, even get this cool-looking decal for your laptop or coffee mug. Please track down Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and help support the show. It's just a little over $1 a show to get in the door. Pretty please. A shout to Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. And also thank you to show sponsor Phillips Law Firm. With an auto accident, you need more than an attorney. You need someone who knows your community. Phillips Law Firm's attorneys are your neighbors here to help. Call 1-800-JUSTICE or visit justiceforyou.com. Phillips Law Firm, unleashing justice for you. All right, let's do this thing. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, our top story this week, looking at police accountability and the fallout from this May Day event happened almost exactly a year ago that led to clashes between Christian activists, LGBTQ protesters. Again, police got in the mix there, arrested 23 people, 16 uses of force. David, I know we've touched on this story before, but there was this meeting this week of the Public Safety Committee that I think was attempting to close the book on this story. I just wanted, what did you come away with after this? What sort of changes is this truly going to lead to when it comes to crowd control policy for the SPD?
Well, there's, I think the big failure or the kind of systemic failure around that particular event seems to be around communication, just that the planning in advance of this event was
like how the permit was distributed and that kind of a thing, and police weren't given a heads up.
Well, yeah, but I think a lot of it, how much preparation the police could or should have done in advance of this, because, some indication that it wasn't particularly well communicated exactly the size and nature of this event. And therefore, there wasn't a lot of preparation done in advance to, just put in barriers, for example, between demonstrators and the actual presenters. I think there's also a little bit of a deeper issue, too, around some quotes that were captured on camera that showed a fairly clear antipathy by some in the Seattle Police Department toward the demonstrators and the protesters. And, so there's kind of two levels to this. The systemic failures, what could have been done around preparation and advanced planning versus I think maybe some feeling by some that there's some inevitability to this because some SPD officers clearly don't feel very warmly toward Capitol Hill protesters. And that kind of presents an inherent conflict from the outset.
Right. Yeah. Making this assumption that these people are Antifa, using that word a few different times there. And I guess what you're talking about is there's some systemic change, but there's a culture change that isn't quite there yet. Or how would you describe that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it just kind of feels like there is this rift that became particularly apparent in 2020 between the police department and a lot of the residents, particularly on Capitol Hill with, CHOP and abandonment of the East Precinct and a lot of Office of Police Accountability investigations that came out of that. And I think there is some sense that that rift has not closed at all, that there is ill feeling towards some people on the police force, toward residents of the city of Seattle. And of course, we know for a fact that the opposite is true as well, that there's not a lot of love for people in the police department from people who live on Capitol Hill. And, that just becomes kind of hard to reconcile, particularly when you have an event like this, where it is sort of a bit of a culture war standoff. You have this kind of inherently conservative religious worldview that is quite anti-LGBTQ in the heart of Seattle's primary LGBTQ neighborhood. So that already is ripe for conflict. And then I think just this assumption in advance that honestly was backed up by some body camera footage later, that the police department might feel more sympathetic towards the kind of more conservative representatives there. And again, I don't know how representative that is of the entire police force, but you do have people on camera speaking pretty negatively toward demonstrators. And so, it felt like there was a little bit of inevitability. But then, you have this other contrast. A couple days later, there was a protest at City Hall that, while tense, the advanced planning seemed to have worked. There weren't any sort of direct clashes. And then months later, this group came back. I don't know if it was exactly the same group, but it was another kind of evangelical, pretty anti-LGBTQ group. I think they went to Gasworks Park this time.
Right.
And again, there was some tension there and some protests, but there wasn't the sort of clashes that we saw in Capitol Hill. And part of that, I think, was there were months of expectation that this was coming and planning. And so I think, it was going to be a tense event no matter what. But what this review shows is not enough was done in preparation to minimize harm in this particular case.
Yeah, I was wondering how this was going to affect that match between Egypt and Iran that was supposed to take place coming up here for the World Cup matches in Seattle. But we're just learning this week that it sounds like Iran has actually withdrawn from that match. So I'm not quite sure what that's going to be, but we're still going to see some big protests out there. Maybe not protests, but certainly rallies in support of Pride Month there in Seattle, which is always a big, big celebration. So I guess I'm just waiting for that next test for the SPD. And I wanted to fold in this piece, too, with you, David, because there's a related story playing out this week. Public Safety Committee Chair Bob Kettle highlighting the fact that the Real-Time Crime Center and its closed-circuit cameras helped in the arrest of a suspect in the assault of a 77-year-old man at 3rd and Pine Street downtown. Councilmember Kettle clearly pushing for more surveillance cameras to be used citywide. And David, do you see this issue coming to a head anytime soon? I just wanted to check in with you on this one. The mayor said she was considering a plan for further expansion. Does she need to make a move here and now? What do you think?
I think members of the council want her to make a clear move before the World Cup, because I think as of right now, the biggest concern is the cameras. Well, there's kind of concerns coming from both directions. From Kettle and the pro camera side, the big concern is this promise by Mayor Wilson to only turn on the stadium district cameras in the event of a credible threat during the World Cup. And I think he and, Councilmember Rivera talked about this too, basically don't believe that getting word of a credible threat ahead of time is guaranteed. And therefore, it's kind of a folly to think that you can keep it in your back pocket and only use it when you need it rather than keeping it all on all the time. The other side, we know well that there's a lot of opposition to installing these cameras. There has been some protest, because one of the pieces that Mayor Wilson said is she was going to turn off the camera near the Planned Parenthood because, out of risk that information could be used against people seeking an abortion or some other kind of care that might be banned in red states. It's some feeling that it's not good enough that camera hasn't been taken down. I've actually seen some of the protests. So, there's a lot of focus on this issue still coming from both directions. And I do think that Mayor Wilson kind of bought herself some time by commissioning that study, and she tried to kind of walk a middle road there. But at a certain point, she is going to have to, ask her get off the pot, and
no
decide which direction.
That.
Decide which direction that she wants to take this.
Yeah. We'll see what happens next with that one. Thank you, David, for keeping it clean for the Seattle News Fuse and Brews crowd here. An interesting budget issue. I wanted to follow up on the World Cup here. The full council this week set to approve spending $32 million on World Cup preparations. $14 million of that comes directly from city funds. There are some state and federal funds in the mix there, too. David, you reported on this in the Seattle Times, and we're looking into this question of what is the city really getting for its money? What did you find in this?
Yeah, it is a cost-benefit proposal, really, at the end of the day here, which is the city thinks it's worth at least $14 million. And that's over 2 budget cycles. So that's 25 and 26. They think it's worth at least $14 million of taxpayer money to bring this event in. And they're probably right by that calculation. It can always be sort of difficult. You hear arguments around stadiums or convention centers or big events that, hey, if Seattle or city, if you sink this amount of money into a convention center, you'll get all these returns. That's always the math around that stuff is always a little dubious. But in the grand scheme of things, $14 million from the city is not that much. And considering that there will be at least some level of uptick in tourist activity, and this will be good for business, even if it doesn't end up being exactly as large or as significant as some expected. There will be an inflow of dollars here that outpaces, I think, normal reality, and that will be good for the city's coffers. So, I'm not hearing a lot of people saying that it's not worth the city spending this $14 million. And the $32 million, I think is illustrative of what it takes to put on an event of this size. Yeah. A lot of that, like you said, is coming from outside grants and maybe, federal and state dollars or directly from the organizing committee. So it's not like a huge amount off of Seattle taxpayers' backs here. It is worth noting, though, that some of the expectations for the event have been revised downwards slightly.
I was going to say some declining attendance numbers maybe here.
Yeah, exactly. But we're not talking dramatic. Visit Seattle initially was saying, we think this will bring in close to $1 billion of economic activity. Now it's maybe down to mid 800s. Okay. Again, it's all pretty specious math for my money, but a lot of people are going to show up to Seattle. It's going to be pretty busy. I don't know how busy, but I would expect that restaurants and buses and hotels are going to be more full, and people are going to be spending more money in Seattle than they otherwise would have been.
Makes sense. All right, well, up next, if you were expecting Sound Transit to expand to the Ballard neighborhood in the next decade as approved by voters, well, you're going to be waiting a while. That story coming up on Now Hear This. Trouble for the Sound Transit Agency compounding over the last week when a new report detailing that a voter-approved expansion into Ballard, originally set to open in 2035, might not be operational until 2050 or later. And plenty of people were up in arms about this at a meeting Monday night in the Ballard neighborhood where the news is starting to settle in. Kirk Hovenkotter from the Transportation Choices Advocacy Group asked Councilmember Dan Strauss at a meeting last week. Strauss, of course, represents the Ballard neighborhood, about the frustrations of seeing 3 options presented from Sound Transit, all of which come up a little short.
None of them got the line to Ballard. What does that mean for the neighborhood, and how are you going to get Ballard back on the map?
Oh, it's bad. It's really bad, and frankly, as politely as I can put it, it's unacceptable.
David, I always struggle with the word unacceptable because while I understand the sentiment there, I always feel like there's something missing, as in, this is unacceptable, and here's what we're going to do about it. It's just rough here. I know the city has been working on cutting some red tape for these projects so they can move a little faster, but with a $34.5 billion budget gap for Sound Transit, I just don't think there's much the city can actually do about this delay for Ballard.
No, it's hard to find what that right answer is. I'm not steeped in the weeds on this stuff, so I think there are probably some things that could be tweaked.
It does get weedy pretty quick, that's for sure.
But it is true, and I thought Erica Barnett made a good point around this, which is like there is this sense from a lot of politicians that they're talking about, this is a yes and we'll get there and blah, blah, blah. And it really is only Dan Strauss who's talking about this as if the proposal doesn't defer or postpone anything. It is a cancellation of a major part of what was sold to voters in 2016. And that, I think part of the reason we are not hearing that from everybody is because that's a pretty tough reality. And people have been spending a lot of money in property taxes on this proposal on this plan. And it is becoming increasingly clear that those dollars are not going to buy what people thought they would. It's an uncomfortable situation too, because, a lot of the Sound Transit 3 package was built in large part to win political buy-in from Pierce and Snohomish County. And so as a result, it became this long spine that is supposed to go down to Tacoma and then go north deep into Snohomish County. And it sort of feels like Seattle's broad support of this is in some ways being punished because it's sort of taken for granted that Seattle would back Sound Transit and that voters would sign off of it. And so, officials bent over backwards to win the more suburban areas. But now it seems like that it's going over budget so significantly. Seattle is poised to be kind of the most punished for those cost errors.
Right. And I'm kind of seeing the logic from a geographic point of view. The Sound Transit wants to complete this spine going north and south here. But when you cut off Ballard, Councilmember Strauss was talking about this, you're cutting off a big population there, big potential revenue stream also for the agency. Can you touch on that piece? Because I think that's leaving out a big chunk of people. Maybe it's not as geographically smart, but man, that's a big population you're cutting off.
Yeah, right. I mean, it has the feeling of, Ballard is a neighborhood and that's cute. Ballard is alone is much bigger than a lot of these suburban cities. I don't know what the population of Linwood is, but it can't be that much bigger than Ballard. It's probably a good deal smaller than Ballard. And so that has been Dan Strauss's point, is Ballard is not a cute Nordic far-flung neighborhood of Seattle anymore. It is a regional center that has seen several upzones. It has more than 100,000 people that live there. It is projected to add more ridership than any new stop added to the system. It just so happens, though, that to get there, you probably have to build another tunnel, and you have to build the station in the middle of an already pretty built-out area. And that's, I think, just trickier from just looking at a map perspective than it is to follow I-5 north and south.
Yeah, I really wonder what's going to happen there, because that seems like a neighborhood that has been pushing for this for a while. But again, I guess just bottom line for me, even though people are protesting in Ballard, and we've definitely seen that over the last little bit, it feels like this is a done deal here. I don't think there's any room to bring Ballard back on the map. Do you?
I don't know what that path is. I'm not smart enough. If I did, maybe I would be making $400,000 a year as CEO of Sound Transit. I don't know, but I don't know, other than new revenue, I guess, or some radical rethinking of what it would take to get there. As of right now, I think what we're looking at with these proposals is ending at Seattle Center, which getting to Seattle Center is fine, but it is not what was sold to voters, and certainly makes the prospect of, say, a Sound Transit 4 a little more murky.
Yeah, tough to stomach, I think, too. That's a good point, too. I did want to follow up on another story in Public Cola this week regarding what appears to be a clash between the mayor's office and the Seattle City Council over the council's work to approve homeless shelters to include more units. We've talked about this on the podcast over the past couple of weeks. As reported in Public Cola, less than a day before this committee vote from the council on this issue, the mayor's office apparently asked the council's land use committee chair, Eddie Lin, to pull the legislation due to some measures that the mayor opposed. Councilmember Lin said, no, that's not quite how this works. The process continues. But, David, this comes across as a move from the mayor that's a little bit unorthodox at the very least. What do you make of this clash?
I think it says something about the way that the mayor's office is coming into government. And I think there's a lot of pretty inexperienced people in that office who don't entirely understand the balance of powers and how seriously the council takes it. I heard a story about the mayor's office adding calendar holds to staffers' emails on the second floor. So, staffers would look at their calendars and find that they had a hold put there by the mayor's office.
Wow.
And there's just, I think, this feeling that the mayor's office is viewing the council as another branch of the executive and not as an independent legislating body. I've heard a little nostalgia for the Harrell administration from people that perhaps you would not expect, waxing nostalgic for the Harrell administration. And I don't know that has much to do with policy so much as a belief that they kind of Harrell was a city council person. He understood.
He took that very seriously. Yes.
He understood how the legislative process worked. He understood what the formal relationship was between the second floor and the seventh floor. It's not even necessarily complaints with Mayor Wilson herself, whom, I haven't heard any stories of uncomfortable conversations directly with her, but more the way in which some of her staff is approaching their interactions with members of the city council, and city council people feeling like they are being treated as extensions of the mayor's office staff. They didn't run a year-long campaign to be an employee of Mayor Wilson, and they're taking great offense to that. There has been some action, perhaps some apologies have been offered to members of the council, though I don't think that's really going to take hold until the next opportunity they get, that they actually show that they have improved the way they are communicating with council. Though the fact that there have been some apologies offered, I think at least in theory, Mayor Wilson understands that there has been some anger coming from the second floor and frustration with how her staff has been interacting there. And honestly, the anger feels palpable enough from the people that I've talked to that I think it would take perhaps a firing or certainly a very kind of intentional approach to whatever the next policy swing is that shows that they have actually learned their lesson. And I don't think just an apology is necessarily going to make a lot of headway.
Yeah, I've heard that too, that this is something pretty deep here. And I guess I'm just looking at the mayor's plan with regard to expanding homeless shelters and how she brought this forward. Usually a mayor will connect with a sponsor on the city council, kind of have them shepherd it through the process. The mayor really didn't do that. Basically kind of gave this to the council and said, we got to do this now. And I don't know if that set council members on edge a little bit to start with, but now we're seeing this extra push. And I guess I'm just looking at this plan to expand shelter, which the council's right in the middle of it right now. How does this relationship and the frayed nature of it, I guess, affect that plan going forward? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it could slow it down. It's sort of, I always struggle with these kind of inside stories because it is important. It speaks to how well the wheels of government turn.
Yeah.
And that has real implications for how policy is enacted.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think at the end of the day, people outside of City Hall only really care about one thing, which is the shelter going to get built? Or are we going to actually pass this?
Figure it out. Right.
Figure it out. And they don't particularly care who has a great personal relationship with one another in City Hall, as long as things are being achieved.
Yeah.
And so, it is a question of how committed is the council to this goal of adding shelter, and do they think it is important enough to kind of forge on despite the real and significant slights that they have felt? I think that there is some recognition that this is an important thing that the mayor is trying to do, and that the public is pretty on board with it. And there's, when you have buy-in from Challenge Seattle and the businesses that opposed Katie Wilson's election in the first place.
Yeah, and Starbucks in the mix too, for sure.
Starbucks, yeah. Organizations and businesses that opposed her election going to bat for her on this. That's a pretty good signal that there is broad support for this, for the shelter plan. And therefore, I do think the council at the end of the day is going to do what it can to help this move forward. But it certainly doesn't help that the political well has been a little poisoned.
Definitely true. All right, well, coming up, folks, another look at AI policy in the city of Seattle, how city leaders are shaping it, and a continuing pushback on data centers while they're at it. That story coming up on What's Next. David, I wanted to touch on an issue that's unfolding in the governance committee this week for the Seattle City Council regarding AI policy. So the mayor spoke out about this last week, saying the city would allow the use of Microsoft Copilot, but that's about it, at least so far. The rest of the possible AI tools that city workers could use, at least, would have to go through a city AI officer who will figure out what's ethical to use and what's not based on how they'll impact workers. I got to say, David, that sounds like maybe where new AI tools could go to die from an unending Seattle process. But what do you make of how this AI policy is coming together?
Well, I do think it's an example of what can happen in a mayoral transition, which is like,
Harold started this thing. Right.
This had pretty good momentum last fall, and Mayor Wilson wanted to hit pause on it. Understandably, AI is such a tricky and just a lot of ethical trapdoors in the AI debate. And I think she wanted to kind of fully understand what was happening before, giving the green light to go. And that's understandable. At the same time, the city has already started to have some of these conversations 6 or 7 months ago.
Yeah.
It's an interesting debate. I thought Mayor Wilson, when she had this kind of vision statement for AI, and I thought it was much more pro AI sounding than maybe I was expecting. She she was talking about how Seattle's the place of innovation, and we're going to be a great home to AI and shape it. And of course, she had some cautionary notes also, but it was a pretty optimistic view of what AI could do in government. I do think government is arguably one of the better places where it could be put to use, because there are just so many bureaucratic slowdowns. You think about the permitting process. There's no real policy reason why that should take months and months and months, other than staffing takes a long time. And I think that is kind of the best use case scenario for AI, is it speeds up permitting or something like that. And I'm sure you can find a lot.
Let me throw in there, I was just looking at some of those stats that there's like this pre-application screening tool that uses AI for these different permits, I should say. Apparently it creates about a 50% reduction in the average days for the intake review of these permits. So it's speeding things up. I just wanted to amplify what you were saying.
Yeah, totally. And, they have maybe there's obviously a lot of data work done in the city, trying to figure out where and why people are getting hit by cars, for example. And the idea being AI can kind of do a lot of that stuff more quickly. There's some project with the University of Washington where they're scraping all of the city's laws and looking for contradictions. And not that that's like the most important thing for day to day, but you do want your city code to be relatively clean, but no one really has the time or energy to go through that and make sure that's all square. So, there are pretty good examples here. I think the unions and some workers are pretty concerned about what this means for their future. If I'm Katie Wilson, it's maybe a little tempting to, when I'm looking at a $500 million deficit over the rest of my term between the next 3 years, hey, maybe AI can help us out here a little bit, but it's going to be a tricky thing to roll it out in a way that gets real buy-in, feels useful to people, and doesn't lead to, mass layoffs necessarily.
And there's a big picture issue here for me too, because I was reading in the mayor's report there, the Seattle area apparently has more than 400 AI companies, 200 plus AI startups. That's a lot of different companies within a small area here. And so I guess I understand this urge to study AI, keep it under control. But what do you make of that fact that an area with so much innovation is also dealing with so much regulation too? And even this whole idea of, putting a moratorium on data centers, there's a bit of a disconnect there, it feels like to me.
Yeah, it does. And I don't really have a great take on that, except for that I think it gets to people's deep uneasiness with this, because I don't know any of the people who are working in those AI. I don't know who those people are. I don't know what worldview they have,
Sure, right.
I'm sure it's mostly positive, but I don't know that for sure. And I think there's just this sense that things are spiraling out of control a little bit, and people are maybe looking to government to slow that down. I'll say as an aside, perhaps that suggests that reports of Seattle's death are a little premature. With all this hand-wringing around business to hear that there are that many AI startups in Seattle. Apparently still a pretty good place to try and start something, but that's an aside. No, I don't know. It's an interesting tension. I think a lot of tech workers in Seattle are probably Katie Wilson voters at the same time. Pretty young demographic, and that mirrors who voted for her. So, you could probably write a whole dissertation on the disconnect between the economic landscape of Seattle and the uneasiness of people who live here with the very technology that helps fund its government.
Right. And I never really thought that the lack of speed from local government could be an asset. But in some cases, I guess you could look at it that way. That's definitely part of the conversation here. We do need to wrap up, David. I need to ask you this big question. So you're Dan Wilson. Do you send one of the Mariners' top solid starting pitchers from over the last few seasons, Luis Castillo, to the bullpen? What do you got?
No, I don't, because I think he can still turn it around, and you got to give him a little space to do that. I think has looked better actually in recent starts. And he's always been a slow starter. I think
with the rest of the team.
I think you give him another month. One more month, and then if it hasn't turned around, then yes.
All right, I'm gonna check back in with you, man. That's right around the corner here in June. We'll see what happens. Luis Castillo, we're hoping for good things in the future from you, my man. Thank you, David, as also for helping me out here. Thanks also to everyone who's listening to Seattle News Views and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron. Check out Seattle News Views and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more, and thank you for the help there. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you tune in. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.